Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of DevOps Unbound. Of course, after our opening kind of credit, I'm always looking to go vroom vroom, but we are ready to vroom vroom today. We're ready to speed right into what I think is going to be a great discussion, and it's a discussion we could have at any time, but through the lens of DevOps, Agile, Lean, and what goes on in today's development cycles and world. I think it's even more important. We're going to be discussing today usability and accessibility, and how DevOps and similar or aligned technologies are changing it, influencing it, how it's being done from a professional point of view. Speaking of professional, I'm really happy to introduce you to our panel this week. We have an amazing panel. First of all, actually a man I used to work with probably more years ago than he wants to admit. Paul Pinkney is with us. Paul, welcome to DevOps Unbound.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Why don't you share a little background with our audience?
I'm a lead designer, user experience designer at a company called Swisslog Healthcare. I have done user experience since before user experience was even a term, including a lot of accessibility stuff, including at Dish Network. I got their Dish Hopper accessible. I worked on accessibility for a network security company and a few other telecoms before that. And currently trying to get us up to speed at my company now.
Excellent. Joining Paul and I is Paula from LaunchDarkly. And again, Paula, I don't want to mangle your last name, but it's Goyanes?
Goyanes, that's right.
Goyanes, okay. Introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, I'm Paula Goyanes. I'm a software engineer at LaunchDarkly. I've been working at LaunchDarkly for a couple of years, but even before I was a software engineer, I've been really interested in web accessibility and just like the inclusion of all people in the web. And I've been advocating really hard at LaunchDarkly for accessibility for a long time now.
Fantastic.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Third member of our panel today is Sean Kelly. Sean, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
My name is Sean Kelly. I'm the VP of User Experience at Trcentis. I've been there a whole whopping 3 months. So we're just getting, we're formalizing our accessibility plans for software plans. And before that, I actually started off in aerospace. So doing accessibility and usability for bombers and fighter jets for about 5 years, then transitioned to healthcare for another, I think, 11 years. So it's really interesting to see how the common themes across different industries actually, how they play out in different circumstances.
Sure is. That is interesting. And then last but not least is my co-host here on DevOps Unbound. He's the co-founder or the founder and CEO of Accelerated Strategies Group. He was my co-founder at previous companies, Mitch Ashley. Hey, Mitchell, welcome.
Hey, it's good to be with you. I just want to say, unlike our other panelists, I am not a user experience designer, though I've worked with 3 fabulous designers and teams starting in the 90s with Josh Stoller and Monica Merricks, and then with Paul Pinkney. So learned a ton from folks like Paul and others and our whole panel.
But you are a user.
I am a user and I do have an experience.
Yes. Okay. There you go then. That qualifies you for this. So guys, first of all, thank you all for joining us. Let's jump into it. So I think, the idea of user accessibility, and I'm blanking right now on the very first sort of, was it 508? What was the number for when we first started saying that websites needed to be accessible for people with limited vision and other sort of handicaps? It wasn't a 508. That's a nonprofit company. But go
ahead.
I think what you may be thinking of is Section 508.
Yes.
For government websites is the thing that says that in the United States, websites have to be accessible.
So that goes back probably 20 years, I'm going to bet, or 15, 18 years. And I think for many of us, that was the stake in the ground, if you will, for accessibility. But of course, I think our expectations around accessibility and our consumers' expectations around accessibility have changed drastically since Section 508 all those years ago. You guys are experts. I'm going to let you. Who wants to give us a brief history of accessibility time?
I guess I could start off with that. Actually, it's interesting in the military world. It actually goes back a little bit further than 20 years ago, starting with Military Standard 1472, which basically outlined how cockpit design should be, including a little bit of display. So more hardware based, and then that led to Section 508 and W3C standards. It's interesting though, I've seen like over the past 20 years, as kind of accessibility went from a checklist, right? Like check the boxes, make sure you do that, more towards a business imperative. You know, we should do this to be better than the competition. And now it's kind of table stakes. So the users actually kind of expect usability as like a baseline, right? It's not enough just to have it anymore. It's become an expectation across a lot of different industries. So that's actually really good to hear, right? Because if users expect that, that means we are forced to make our products more accessible. And it's really interesting to see the evolution of that over time.
I'll just add a little bit. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, please join in.
Sure, I'll just add on to that. One of the things I noticed, especially when Section 508 first came out, is it was very technical. There were a lot of requirements about how you tag things like tables and things like that. And it was just very much on the development side. And a lot of those some of those have actually relaxed a little bit in favor of things to design on the front end more. So it's gone from much less on the technical side, even though there are additional technical requirements now, but some of those have actually kind of gone away because they found out they weren't really all that useful and they were really difficult to do in favor of more on the design side. The other thing is, I don't know if people are aware of CVAA, which is the Consumer Video Accessibility Act. And they were falling kind of behind the web world. So things like set-top boxes from Dish and other companies like that, DirecTV, they had to kind of get caught up. And it wasn't until about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, when we really, all of a sudden out of nowhere, it felt like out of nowhere, we were kind of behind the 8 ball. We had to get all the set-top boxes up to date. Because one of the things I noticed when I first started at Dish is they were relying on these colored buttons on the remote control. Well, 3 of them are red, yellow, and green. So already you're way behind the 8 ball with that all by itself. So we had to redesign our remote control. Then we had to add text to audio or text to speech and audio description and even things like Bluetooth audio so people could put in hearing aids and obviously closed captioning and things like that. So just wanted to throw that in as well.
Absolutely. Paula, you want to comment?
Yeah, I wanted to mention, since we're kind of talking about the law, in terms of the law, the other thing in the United States that really upholds web accessibility is the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA has been the thing cited in a bunch of these lawsuits. And Section 508 was amended, I think in like the late 90s, like 1998, I want to say something like that. But really, we've been leaning a lot on the ADA since it's like accommodation of public spaces for like non-government websites, for example, to be able to actually file those lawsuits. Like erudite and philosopher Beyonce was actually sued not too long ago for having an inaccessible website. So, you know,
Really?
Anybody is open to it. The Domino's lawsuit was a big deal maybe a year or two ago. So yeah, and that's just the United States. Web accessibility, I think Canada has like very robust laws around web accessibility. So it's not just here in the US.
What about EU? Is there any specific EU kind of regulations to worry about here?
I'm sure there are, although I can't I remember acronyms off the top of my head here. But yeah, I'm sure, listen, if it's in the US and it's in Canada, it's in the EU.
Interesting.
You know, one of the things I was going to jump in with, Alan, is that when I was experienced this kind of exposed to user experience and accessibility, there's a lot of focus around visual impairments, of course, and ways to design applications. And of course, we have hearing and ability to input and speech to text and text to speech and all those kinds of things. So it's all of those things individually, but it's also collectively, because oftentimes you may have someone who have more than one disability. So it's a challenging field, but it's also, I think, a very rewarding field from the people that I talk with, because you are literally helping people, and how they interface with the world, at least through computers, softwares, hardware, et cetera.
That actually brings up a really good story from my healthcare days too. So you mentioned multiple disabilities and so forth and designing for that. So I worked on the Kaiser Permanente website. That was my main focus. This is back in like late to mid 2000s. And we had to design a care facility website for neuropsychiatric patients that were going through rehabilitation and so forth. So we really had to make it accessible for people that had traumatic brain injuries. And that was probably the hardest design challenge I've ever had to do in my life, right? There's no standard for that. You really have to talk to people that have brain injuries and figure out, okay, how do I take this really dense, complicated medical information and distill it down in a way that's going to make sense for people that don't have, memory that works like most people do. So that was through a lot of user testing, and it was probably one of the most rewarding projects I've ever done as well, just because it was so, we kind of brought, more people to the table of using that product that were previously shut out before. And that's such a rewarding feeling. I'm pretty sure people on the panel also have stories like that too.
I mean, and that is a great thing. I think it also brings up, Sean, something that we need to hit on. When I first became aware of Section 508 and designing websites, it was really about visual impairment, right? You had to assume, if someone had a visual impairment, was that website usable? Even if it was a relatively minor one, like color blindness, and they couldn't tell red, green, or what have you, right? When so many buttons were red, stop, green, go, and stuff like that. But when we talk about accessibility, I'd like to think, have evolved since 25 years ago. And it's more than just visual impairments, right? Sean mentioned cognitive kind of impairments. Paul, I'm, at Dish, I'm sure was a lot of visual, and Paula, what other kind of impairments do we try to design around or design for with our accessibility solutions today?
Yeah, in the W3C website, there's actually a list of all kinds of impairments. So there's cognitive, neurological, mobile impairments, as well as visual impairments, hearing impairments. But I think something really important to note about accessibility is that it benefits everyone. And it's not just permanent disabilities. There are also temporary limitations, like I've got a baby in one arm, so I'm typing with one hand, or the light is really bright coming out through my window, or I am hungover. 2020 has been very hard on all of us. I'm not hungover right now, though. All of those are temporary limitations.
I'm gonna take your word for it.
and all of those kind of what benefits those situations, those temporary limitations, are what benefits people with disabilities as well. And I think something really interesting to note is that, yes, like we are building and designing for people with, neurological impairments, people with visual impairments, but really, I think it's important for the framing to be not, I'm designing for this person with a visual impairment, it's I'm designing for this user flow, or like this, being able to accomplish this goal, regardless of what your disability might be.
And I think that's an important piece of it too. It's not just how do I make this website better for people who have X, Y kind of impairment. It's about what do we want people to accomplish, right?
Yeah, I'll add to that and say I totally agree. And the other thing is, one of the things you find that when you do a lot of these, you design for accessibility, it's good for everybody. It's not just anybody with particular impairments or anything like that. You're bumping up the usability for literally everybody in most cases. The other thing I'd mention, you wanted to talk about other kinds of disabilities. The interesting thing at Dish was, for example, designing for blind people. One of the things people didn't realize, blind people watch TV and they call it watching TV. And so you need to provide those facilities so they can actually interpret what's going on with the show, because it's a very social thing. They get with all their friends, including a lot of blind friends, and they talk about these things, what's going on with this show, and that sort of thing. So that's something that I'm not sure many people have considered.
Now, there's also the universal impairment we all have, which is setting the clock on your VCR. I don't think that's been solved yet. Just throwing it a little
Bitch,
bit.
you're showing your age. I don't know how many of these people have VCRs anymore.
It's a 3-letter acronym. I thought
Yeah.
we'll use it.
Yeah, it's what they used to tape stuff on. But you just setting your clock on any appliance can be a challenge.
Hey, you know,
But,
my cassette deck here. What are you talking about?
Yeah, 8-track tapes. But anyway, but no, I mean, these are all really great and valid points in that we need to do that. But you know, there's another aspect talking about the user. So for instance, if you use an iPhone, and I'm sure it's probably like this on Android too, there's a whole section in the configuration settings on iPhone, accessibility, where you can have better contrast, change the fonts, make more sound notifications or less, or what have you. And I'm going to tell you, you know, true confession time here. I was hesitant to enable some of those applications that would enhance my usability, my user experience, the same way I was hesitant to take the discount at the movie theater. You know, when they said, "Oh, you qualify for a senior discount," I said, "Oh," you know, and I said, "I'll take the money, fine, give me the discount." But you know, or getting that AARP card on the day of your 50th birthday. So, you know, how much does that play into it? Where some users don't want to take advantage of what we're doing around accessibility to make it easier for them. I mean, how do you design that into the equation? Sean?
Well, yeah, I think it's kind of like what Paula said. It's just if you design it, you just kind of bake it into the design solution, right? So it's not like a separate design solution. You use the use case and just make it accessible for everyone. So for example, contrast ratios, right? I think most people, I don't know, it's been a long time, but most people in their early 20s can probably look at those little tiny icons on the iPhone, for example, and make sense of it. But I mean, I can't, right? I'm 42 and I would not personally, just out of sheer, I don't know, ego preservation, would not go into the settings to change the contrast ratio for my icons, right? But I think if you just make that one solution for everybody, it just kind of works and you don't have to think about it. And I think, you know, except in very limited cases, that's the right solution to go with.
But Apple's the maven of design, right? We all, you know, look to Apple, but yet they have this. They've done that. So are you saying they poor design on their part?
No. I mean, so they have kind of two levels of accessibility, right? The levels of accessibility they kind of bake in that's going to hit a lot of people. Then there's like this super set where you might need a little extra. So it's funny because they have the accessibility settings, but with a regular design, it's already built in and you don't even see it or you don't think about it.
Paul, interested in, you know, in your dish experience, so do we make accessibility an option, or as Sean says, it's just built in, there is no option?
It depended on what it was. Like, for example, you don't want text to speech on by default. That's just going to really annoy people. You know, I think we've seen this on like DVDs and Blu-rays where they automatically turn on all this stuff. And so most people don't want closed captioning on by default. So they wind up having to go back and turn it off. It's just weird. There's only a handful that seem to have done that. But I'm trying to remember the other things we have to do. But certainly the color blindness thing was a big thing. And basically when we took care of anybody with any kind of CVD or color vision deficiency, it actually was easier for people to even just look at a remote and see a symbol rather than a color and that sort of thing. The other thing we did is for example, we decided when you pick up the remote, maybe one of the automatic things we did is the keyboard lights up right on the remote control. Guess what? That wasn't just for people with vision problems. That was, everybody really loved that one because a lot of people watch TV in the dark. So
yeah, no, I appreciate that on my iPad.
Think about voice
Mitchell?
control. I mean, there are things that are
Yeah,
sold as
voice control.
features, right? And voice control for that are built into remote controls and different electronics. That's a big feature that are advertised by the cable companies and others. So, and of course, that improves accessibility too.
Guys, I got a couple of different angles here that I want us to go in on. Let's turn from accessibility on its own now as it relates to primarily people who have challenges to usability, which is closely aligned with it, but is maybe a little bit broader in our scope, right? What, and all three of you, designing and interfaces and so forth, what would have been some of the big breakthroughs you think we've made around usability that have enabled this world we live in where everything's an app? And it's, it amazes me is 3-year-olds can figure apps out like this. People who get a little older kind of struggle. And there must be something about usability, a lesson there somewhere. But what do you think on that, Paula? Why don't you kick off?
Yeah, I think there's been an adoption of universal design, where it's kind of to the point that Sean and Paul were making previously, which is like, making sure that you design with like inclusion in mind from the get-go. And then you can have like a second layer of accessibility, if you have like special like needs just above what is already there. I mean, this is the equivalent of like in the real world, having like at the front of a building, like a really nice ramp kind of along a set of stairs, it looks very beautiful, as opposed to having like some janky ramp at the back of the building, where you can't like just access it like everybody else does if you have a different need. So I think that first example, right, in the real world is more like universal design. And I think there's been a breakthrough in making sure that our apps are kind of starting with universal design, and that's going to improve usability, right? Because accessibility benefits everybody, and anything that is accessible is probably going to improve usability. I think also just like, having to use touch screens and the fact that technology kind of permeates every aspect of our lives, and maybe we're using technology while we're driving, for example, or like while we are distracted, while we are pushing a grocery cart with one hand, has really pushed us to like design and build, really usable things, even in limited situations.
Fair enough. Paul?
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that is, yeah, and I agree with that, is we've gone forward in a lot of respects, and I also feel like we've gone backward. And the reason I say that is, for example, when you talk about kids being able to get on an iPad and figure it out, it's because they're willing to explore. They're very playful. They like to explore things. They find things. Whereas you have somebody who's not quite so, shall we say, technologically brave, like say my mother, the affordances aren't there. So she doesn't know how to get to certain things, because you have to do a lot of discovery sometimes to use something like an iPad. So we got to be a little bit cognizant of that. I think the lack of affordance in a lot of features is something we need to make sure we work on a little bit, because some of these devices for people who are a little bit scared of technology are very difficult actually to use. But in terms of things like touch targets, for example, I think touchscreens have helped us with even desktop web applications, for example, because we're looking at things like, I forget if it's Hicks or Fitts law, where basically the ability to and the speed with which you can actually click on a control has to do with its size and the distance you are from that thing. And touchscreens have taught us a lot about, let's make things big. Don't make these little bitty text pieces that we used to do that you could click on nicely with a mouse, because a mouse gives you a lot of control. Instead, let's make these nice big targets, and that helps everybody.
Yep. Sean, any thoughts on that?
Well, they did a pretty good job. I had a list of things I was going to mention, and I think about more than half of them got checked off as they were talking. So definitely, I think one thing that's also helped out too, about a couple more things, voice controls as well, because that kind of forces people to make the interactions as simple as possible. And that kind of carries over from voice design into actual physical screen design, for example. The other thing too, it's a little bit meta, but it's also the broadening of what we mean by user experience. So I think, I mean, I've seen it kind of be more expansive, right? Where before we just considered the end product experience itself, right? And I think now we're looking at experience in a broader sense, where it's, you know, what's the person's ecosystem? What is their environment? How are they learning this? So for example, and I'm sure Paula can speak to this being a software engineer, it is harder than hell to learn a new programming language if you don't have the right basis for it, right? And no matter how easy the tool is to use, for example, like a software tool, like in the tech space, no matter how usable it is, if you don't have that foundational knowledge, it's going to be completely difficult. So I think we've seen the definition expand to include things like learning or helping people understand not just how to use the product, but educating about the discipline as well. And I mean, I'm kind of jealous of people that are coming out of school now learning programming, because there's a lot of like online tutorials, there's a lot of in-product support to learn things, and a lot of community forums. That's part of the broader definition of experience. I think that's really helped improve usability of the products as well.
Sure. All right.
You know, one of the big advances I want to add to this conversation is, again, I'll show my age. I can remember the day of wireframes just printed on paper. Simulated mouse pointer manipulated by a pencil or something to simulate a design. Think about the tools that we have today that designers can use to build a complete graphical interface, sometimes even simulating full application or most of the application functionality to do usability testing, but also to experiment and make rapid changes. So the tool set, the technology to embody the design is so much better than even, I would say, even 10 years ago. You think about it in the Xcode development environment, what the UI simulation tools were, very basic Mac app or an app for a phone. Now it's, okay, I want to see this on every model of every phone, on watches and on my webpage. You can do that from a design tool. Again, not just about accessibility, it's got a lot of other capabilities, but it's a great environment to work in. I'm kind of like Sean says, what a great place to start if you're getting in the industry now.
Yeah.
That brings a very good point, actually, too. I think more than anything, it's also, we don't have to sell user testing anymore. Well, not as much anyway. Where before, I remember I had to fight.
Careful, Sean. I know you're only there 3 months, but I will give you a hint. In Trcentis, do never say you don't have to sell testing. Just kidding.
Let me rephrase that.
Yeah.
So for user testing, right, we can put our prototypes in front of users a lot quicker because of the tooling and because of broader organizational support for testing. And yeah, you can just test a lot more people a lot faster with the new tools and so forth. And I think our testing methods have actually evolved over time as well. So I think that's also, because that rapid feedback from our users before production, we get a lot, we get so much rich data from that.
That kind of brings me into where I want to, okay, go ahead, Paul, I'll jump in after you, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I don't know if you and Mitch, I'm sure Mitch remembers this, but one of the things I wound up doing back at that network security company we worked for was putting together click-through prototypes, because there was really no other way to actually show people how the actual interaction design works. Before that, it was just sort of, you know, it's just wireframe by wireframe, or, you know, even a hi-fi sort of screenshot or design, that sort of thing. You really never got a feeling for the interaction design. So I wound up writing, you know, a ton of JavaScript so I could actually show people how the interaction works, not just, and I could actually usability test right off that before it ever went into development. And now we have things like Figma and Envision and stuff, which are absolutely wonderful. But it took a lot of work back then to, you know, get those actually interactive.
I remember that.
I do too.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, though, you know, accessibility and usability in the age of DevOps, which is, you know, we're DevOps Unbound here, right? And so, I mean, there's good and bad. I think, Sean, you nailed it. The good is, hey man, we're doing usability and accessibility testing pre-deployment as part of our design, which is a lot better than feedback loops, but, you know, going back to go every time, right? But on the other hand, when you're changing your application and potentially your UI, making little changes, even if they're just little changes, 10 times a day or 100 times a day, sometimes what was fixed can get broken. Or, you know, you could do I call it the DevOps cha-cha, one step back, two steps forward, one step back. And you know, how do we do that? How do we account for that in our usability and you know, design in a DevOps world like that? Paula?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to start having an accessible site really early on, right? So like at the beginning of your site, like the beginning of your company, if you invest in accessibility, you can really avoid these mistakes. The reason being that like all of the code examples from before will already have been accessible. The reason being that like the design systems that you put in place will already be accessible. And so when you design something new and you iterate on it, like you're taking design elements that are already accessible, right? Like really investing at the beginning is, I think, the best way to really kind of fight against this.
Paul or Sean? Or
Yeah, I
Rich?
wholeheartedly agree to that. And I think the best way to design, to invest up front is to bake it into your design pattern library. So basically it's kind of creating that common set of reusable components, code components and design components. And hopefully most of the design changes are just rearranging those components or those Lego bricks, right? But if each brick has accessibility baked into it, that doesn't break the code in terms of accessibility. So I think that's probably the best way to solve it. It's also probably one of the most difficult, and just because you have to do that up front, right? You have to do that. You have to make your design pattern library up front. You have to maintain that code base. But once you actually have that set up, it just makes development so much faster anyway. So it's actually a win-win for everybody, for accessibility and for developers.
Mitchell, Paul, anything?
Yeah, one thing, I'm relatively new to my company as well, so I'm trying to introduce quite a bit, including we're creating our own design system right now. But one of the things I want to introduce, and I don't have any results of this, but I really want to educate our testers, our QA people, very much on how to test a site or a product for accessibility. You know, doing things without, you know, with just a keyboard and putting your mouse away and those sorts of things. So I think if we do a lot more of that and they kind of do regression testing in that way, at least once in a while, we can ensure accessibility quite a bit more as well.
Sure.
Yeah, that is a good point. And that does bring me to another point, which is you can also kind of bake it into your development process in terms of linting. So there's a lot of really great linters out there, for example, for JSX, there's JSX-A11Y. And if you don't know, accessibility is often abbreviated as A11Y. And so that'll stop you from making mistakes early on. And to Paul's point about testing, I mean, yeah, accessibility can actually be baked into like your testing process. Your end-to-end tests, you know, can run after you push to your master or primary branch, and they can test accessibility as well. There's a lot of tools out there for making that possible. For example, PA11Y can help you do that. You can then go ahead and monitor that in something like Datadog. So similar to how you monitor other things that can break in your code, you can monitor accessibility and consider it a regression or a bug when something breaks and catch that before you go to production.
You know, one of the
Excellent
things I'm
stuff.
curious about is the acceptance of usability design, usability testing by the developer community, DevOps community. How much has that improved? Is it now, you know, security people struggle with, okay, let's shift left and get security built into the application more, but you've been at this a lot longer. What's the acceptance like now by software teams and people leading development?
My experience is it varies a lot. It depends on the particular personnel involved. One of the things I found that's really helped is in the design system I'm putting together, I put a lot of rationale in there. I don't just give people specs and say, follow this. I don't take any kind of draconian approach to any of it. In fact, I want a lot of feedback, and I've baked in, I put a lot of their feedback, including from engineers, back into the design system itself. But explaining the rationale of why are we doing things this way, and even if they don't fully, even if they don't fully read the site and go through it in detail, giving presentations about here's why we do the things we do, and I can tell you a lot of engineers really appreciate that. They love, or developers, they love knowing why they're going through the pains of doing some of these things. And they see the rationale, and then they see it developed, and they see that, oh yeah, this is so much easier to use. And I've seen a lot of that. There are others who are a little more resistant to such things. It's just a little bit individual in that respect.
Absolutely. Hey, Sean, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Oh no, okay.
We know you're only there 3 months, but talk to us. What does Trcentis have built into their testing, solutions for accessibility, usability testing? Is that something Trcentis plays in? Or are you dealing more with how to build that into the actual Trcentis products?
So yeah, so my vantage point is more of how to build it into the product. So we're looking at ways to kind of standardize our look and feel in our UI, right? And as part of that, even before we start making the very first sketch file to represent what those components look like, we need to bake in what the accessibility requirements are. So I'm looking at it from that perspective.
Got it. So guys, we haven't really mentioned COVID much, right? And we can't do it's always the elephant in the room in 2020. How has the pandemic, people working from home, everything that comes out of this nightmare of a situation, how has that had any effect on usability, accessibility at all?
Oh, from my standpoint, it's helped. This is the one silver lining of this whole storm of COVID. It's I think it's just making people more inherently empathetic because they've been experiencing the pain of remote tools not being up to snuff, for example. And I think that it's giving people a different mindset for others. And it's exposed a lot of holes in like our the way that we think about things, right? And that's forced people to think about others in a way that they haven't before. So I've noticed there's actually been a lot more enthusiasm, a lot more support, and a lot more proactive discussion about accessibility and inclusive design, for that matter, because of COVID.
Absolutely. Paula, any thoughts?
I think that's a great point. I think to add to that, I think a lot of people are doing things online that they were doing in person before. Like I know my grandparents are shopping online when they would shop in person before. And I don't have any data to actually support this, but I imagine that that's definitely driven the desire to have accessible websites.
In a sense, we've been sort of lucky in that we're a global company, so we do so much work together online that I feel very fortunate that I work for this company, because the transition has actually been relatively simple. It's for most of us, it's actually helped because we just get so much more work done. But we already had so many tools in place for working with each other, but we're even discovering more. Like I'm putting together a thing called a feedback workshop where you have online post-it notes, and while you're giving a design presentation, everybody just sort of stays quiet and they write down their notes, and then we sort of put them into buckets and we talk about them later. And we actually get through design reviews much more quickly. And it's mainly because we're not doing these things in person. We've never thought about doing it this way.
Yeah, no, I get it. Last subject, because we're running low on time. My experience, and I've been in the technology business 30 years, is that a lot of times things like accessibility, usability, quite frankly, even security, are not afterthoughts, but bolted on after the fact. They're not built into that design from the get-go. And we're in an age now where we're seeing, like, for instance, Kubernetes cloud native infrastructure, right, for deployments really kind of be the de facto standard. But it's always my experience that deployment tools for Kubernetes, or whatever the latest greatest fad or trends are, it takes a little while for accessibility, usability to catch up to those latest and greatest things. Are we because of some of the stuff we've spoken about here today, will we avoid that pitfall with the latest crop of technologies that we're using, right? So has accessibility, usability become so mainstream that we build it in from the get-go? Sean, that's a big part of your mission, I bet, at Trcentis. What do you think?
It really is, and not to oversell it, but I think that a lot of successful companies are building it in right where it's expected. And I've seen a lot of companies that haven't done that, that take that old approach to kind of bolting it on right. I've seen them kind of fall by the wayside. So just through kind of like the process of natural selection and how companies evolve and how they grow revenue over time, the companies that do actually build it in are the successful ones. So I think, yeah.
No, that's fair. Paul, go ahead.
I totally agree with that. And I just to add to that, I just think the marketplace now is one where people expect it. It's no longer a desire to have usability and user experience built in. It's an expectation. And if you don't build it in, especially right away, you're very likely to fail.
Actually, Paula, I'm trying to do something else too. It's like, I know that whenever I interview new designers, for example, right, I think what we're seeing as well is that a lot of people, a lot of designers especially, are really socially conscious, right? And just nuts and bolts trying to recruit for new talent and so forth. If you don't have accessibility baked into your process or you don't have a position on it, it is really hard to recruit design talent because of it. So, I mean, I'm not saying that's the reason to do accessibility, but definitely if you don't do it, that's one of the benefits of, or that's one of the drawbacks of not having it, is that you can't recruit the talent needed to make the great designs of your products in the first place.
Excellent. Paula?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I'm not sure whether or not the new crop of technology will necessarily mean that it'll be accessible from the get-go. There's still a lot of barriers to this. It's not invested in. I think we're starting to understand why we should invest in accessibility more. But there's still an overwhelming percentage of the internet which is not accessible, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, I do think there's a trend towards more accessible, and like Paul said, right, a lot of people are much more socially conscious now, and that definitely helps. And to Sean's point, it's important to hire, like, a lot of people who are getting hired nowadays care about accessibility. So yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
hey, Mitchell, you want to take I was going to say take the last word here.
Going to jump in and say there's one universal skill every software user has, and that's to sniff out bad software. And we live in a world of choice. We have tons of choices. Think about all the apps for your phone, on your phone. It's no longer it's word processing, right, or for documents. You have tons of choices, and people have options. And I think that that's not something that the business side of the house understands of why great design. It's not just good design, it's great design. People choose and build loyalty with companies like Apple. Because they have such loyalty to their design standards and the accessibility, usability of their products. They really like that. And that can be a major differentiator. I also want to share one other thought, to kind of a future thing to think about that I'm concerned about, that we don't understand much yet about COVID. And that's the impact, the neurological impact to individuals, because there apparently is some residual impact to some people who have COVID. And that may be with us for a long time. We don't know if it's temporary or if it's the longevity of it. But we could have a society of large numbers of people that have some level of impact from that. And that could be a lasting impact of COVID that we need to design more effectively for those kinds of situations for end users. Let's hope not. But if it is, I think it's something we have to take extremely seriously.
Agreed. Listen, Sean, Paul, Paula, thanks for joining Mitchell and I on this episode of DevOps Unbound. I think it's been a great discussion around usability and accessibility. We're going to revisit it again in the future, and we'd love for you to come join us. But we're going to have to call an end to this DevOps Unbound episode. Thank you all for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. DevOps Unbound, past episodes, our monthly roundtables, even the audio-only podcast versions of these are all available at devopsunbound.com. So you can go there to see the whole collection and take your pick of which ones you'd like to experience. Guys, thanks very much. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps Unbound. Many thanks to Trcentis for sponsoring our DevOps Unbound series. We'll be back. Actually, we have a great roundtable coming up, Mitchell, this month.
We do.
And we have another show we'll be on in 2 weeks. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day.